This morning we'll speak a little bit about Krishna Tattva and also Krishna Lila. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So I've chosen a verse from the first canto Srimad-Bhagavatam. It's a rather famous verse. It's on the board up here, so we'll chant it responsively. Vadanti tat tattvavidas tattvam yaj jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti sabhyate. Vadanti tat tattvavidas Tattvam yaj jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti sabhyate. Please chant.
Vadanti tattvavidas tattam jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti sabhyate. Vedanti tattvavidas tattvam yaj jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti sabhyate.
So synonyms, Vedanti, they say that, Tattva Vida, the learned souls, Tattvam, the absolute truth, yet which, Jnanam, knowledge, Advayam, non-dual, Brahmi iti, known as Brahman, Paramatma iti, known as Paramatma, Bhagavan iti, known as Bhagavan, Sabhyate. It so sounded. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. Learned transcendentalists who know the absolute truth call this non-dual substance Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan. Purport. The absolute truth is both subject and object, and there is no qualitative difference there. Therefore, Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan are qualitatively one and the same. The same substance is realized as impersonal Brahman by students of the Upanishads, as localized Paramatma by the Hiranyagarbhas or the yogis, and as Bhagavan by the devotees. In other words, Bhagavan, or the personality of Godhead, is the last word of the absolute truth. Paramatma is the partial representation of the personality of Godhead, and impersonal Brahman is the glowing effulgence of the personality of Godhead, as the sun rays are to the sun god. Less intelligent students of either of the above schools sometimes argue in favor of their own respective realization, but those who are perfect seers of the absolute truth know well that the above three features of the one absolute truth are different perspective views seen from different angles of vision. As it is explained in the first sloka of the first chapter of the Bhagavatam, the Supreme Truth is self-sufficient, cognizant, and free from the illusion of relativity. In the relative world, the knower is different from the known, but in the absolute truth, both the knower and the known are one and the same thing. In the relative world, the knower is the living spirit or spiritual superior energy, whereas the known is inert matter or inferior energy. Therefore, there is duality of inferior and superior energy. Whereas in the absolute realm, both the knower and the known are of the same superior energy. There are three kinds of energies of the supreme energetic. There is no difference between the energy and the energetic, but there is a difference of quality of energies. The absolute realm and the living entities are of the same superior energy, but the material world is inferior energy. The living being in contact with the inferior energy is illusioned, thinking he belongs to the inferior energy. Therefore, there is a sense of relativity in the material world. In the absolute world, there is no such sense of difference between the knower and the known, and therefore everything there is absolute. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare. So we want to discuss this morning two basic questions. Who is Krishna? And why do we worship him along with Srimati Radharani and all the gopis we see on the altar today? Who is Krishna and why do we worship him with Srimati Radharani and all the gopis? To answer that question can obviously take many lifetimes. Paunam Janmanante Jnanamam Bhavjite Vasudeva Sarvamiti Samahatma Sadulabham. Krishna declares in Bhagavad Gita that only after many, many lifetimes of studying these questions, who is Krishna and why do we worship Krishna along with Srimati Radharani and the gopis, after many, many lifetimes one may get some glimpse into the truth that is the answer to those questions. So I'm not as pretentious enough of a person to sit here and say that in the next few minutes, half hour or so, we can have definitive answers to those questions. However, by following what I've heard from authorities, what I've learned from my spiritual masters of Grace Srila Prabhupada, and by the mercy of all you devotees, perhaps I can say something in this regard. Who is Krishna? Why do we worship him along with Srimati Radharani and the gopis? Srila Sanatana Goswami describes in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita what our condition is, or where we are, what's the starting point for understanding these questions. We need to start at the beginning, the basic thing, so we build on that basic understanding till we get a complete understanding. So Sanatana Goswami says, you start with this question, Kayami, who am I? How can we think that we can understand Krishna if we don't even know who we are? Kayami, he starts there. Who am I? And why am I suffering? We may not care who we are, but we care about our sufferings. And if knowing who we are helps us get rid of our sufferings, then we're anxious to know. So who am I and why am I suffering? To answer those questions, people in general have a tendency to look towards God, to try to get some information, try to get some answers to their suffering based on what various religious scriptures around the world say. And so that's the prescription that Sanatana Goswami gives also. That we try to get some understanding of who we are beyond just this material life, which is so frustrating and so persistent in its frustration of our desires to be free from suffering. We turn to the scriptures. And so in the Vedic tradition, that's there also. And who am I and why am I suffering begin to be answered in the Upanishads. Upanishads are the philosophical portion of the Vedas. The Vedic literatures have so much about sacrifice, worship of demigods. But in the Upanishads, which is a philosophical section of the Vedic literatures, we start to get some information about, some philosophical information about who I am and why am I suffering. So in the Katha Upanishad, there's a verse, Nityo Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam Eko Bhavanam Yo Vididati Kama. That who I am is one of many, many unlimited number of spiritual entities who find our relation, who find ourselves in relation with the supreme living entity. Nityo, Nityananam. Nityananam, many, the many. Nityo, the one. The one maintains the many. And that one is a living being, and we're all, the living entities are also living beings. But the many are dependent on the one. And this is a key thing to understand as we begin our spiritual life. That we are dependent beings. We're not independent. We like to think we're independent, but we're not. We're dependent beings, and that's the first thing we need to understand. But dependent upon who? Dependent upon the Supreme Lord. And so, this verse that we read from Srimad-Bhagavatam, 1st canto, 2nd chapter, 11th verse, tells us information about who is God. Actually, Srimad-Bhagavatam, that's the main subject of Srimad-Bhagavatam. Who is God? And how can I know more about this relationship of dependence that I have on God? That's the purpose of Srimad-Bhagavatam. As you may know, Srimad-Bhagavatam has 10 subject matters, 10 primary subject matters. The creation, the sub-creation, protection by the Lord. There are 10, I don't know them all on the top of my head. Manvantaras. But then the 10th is ashraya, or shelter. But our acharyas have explained that basically there are 9 subjects. The 9 subjects are simply explaining the 10th subject, ashraya. The main function of Srimad-Bhagavatam, the main subject matter, is ashraya, or the shelter of all living beings. So that should be attracted to that. That should be attracted to those of us who are searching. We understand our dependent nature, and we're searching for some shelter or who we're dependent upon. We're like an orphan. We have needs. We need shelter. So where are we going to find that shelter? We find it in Srimad-Bhagavatam. In this particular topic of Srimad-Bhagavatam, ashraya, or shelter. So what does shelter mean? If we break it down a little bit, shelter. It means that's our origin. That's where we find our origin. That's where we get the maintenance, our maintenance in life. That's where we get protection. As I say, one of the subject matters of Srimad-Bhagavatam is protection. So we see how the Lord protects his devotees, like he protects Prahlad Maharaj from the demonic activities of his father Hiranyakasipu. So that protection actually is a function of taking shelter. We take shelter and we get protection. So protection actually just expands the meaning of ashraya, or taking shelter. So origin, our maintenance, our protection, our refuge, that is ashraya. And that's where we can take shelter to find out who we are and why we're suffering. But there's much more available to us. Srila Jiva Goswami explains that how we take shelter, how we should take shelter. And the example is given of what our relationship is like with anybody if we're their servant, if we're a servant or subordinate to anyone. Generally speaking, our relationship is going to be deferential, humble, submissive, cooperative, like that, like we would expect if you were a servant in someone, that you display that kind of behavior. So we see that that's the type of behavior that accompanies ashraya. When we find our shelter in Krishna, we naturally have an attitude, a deferential attitude, a worshipful attitude toward Krishna. I always wondered why we emphasize worship Is that not an artificial imposition on us that we have to worship somebody? No, it's not. It's natural. Where you find shelter, where you find protection, you're grateful for that, and it causes you to be deferential and even reverential in your service. So we should search out ashraya, shelter. And when we find that shelter, we should surrender there. But surrender is of two types. Surrender is accompanied by love or affection, or surrender is without love, more obligatory rather than based on love. So if you were approaching the shelter of the Supreme Lord, and you know from Shastra that the Supreme Lord is a person, this gets back to the verse we're talking about today. Vedanti tat tattvavidas tattvajyas jnanamadvayam brahmeti brahmatmeti bhagavaniti sapyate. Ultimately, this verse describes the Supreme Lord as a person. He's all-pervasive in his Brahman feature. He's localized as a Paramatma in the heart of every living being, in each atom and between each atom as Paramatma. And as Bhagavan, he's a person. He's a person that has many different potencies, abilities, energies, however you want to phrase them. He's completely able to give you shelter. You may be looking for shelter in that you need money to maintain yourself and your family. You may need shelter in terms of other material necessities of life. You may need shelter in terms of seeking loving relationships. So Bhagavan indicates that he's a person and he can perfectly reciprocate with you in terms of the needs that you have. So therefore, we surrender. Now, let me ask you, which do you think is better, surrendering with love or surrendering without love? With love. We're dealing with a person. It's not just some wall or something like that, or some impersonal object or some stone. It's a person that we're dealing with. And so that person is going to be more satisfied if we take our position of ashraya or shelter in him with love than if we do it just out of some obligation or out of some ritual. This is actually the difference between deity worship and just some ritual. The deity is a person, fully capable of reciprocating in a personal way with all of us. Do we believe it? Do we believe it? Or do we think that the deity is a stone? Prabhupada would say about deity worship, are we so fool? People question the deity stone. He said, are we so fool that we give so much time, energy, money, decoration, intelligence, art, our heart, our love to stone? Are we so fool that we do that? No. The deity is a person. Bhagavan is a person. And our best approach for achieving shelter of a person is to do it with love, to approach with love. And so that's what we do. We approach Bhagavan with love. Now, Bhakti Yoga, as presented by Rupa Goswami and the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Prabhupada gave it as Nectar Devotion, explains the science of loving that person who we've taken shelter of. How can we develop our love? How can we express our love to that person that we've taken shelter of? Well, Rupa Goswami takes us from the tattva we've been talking about to the lila, because in lila, the Lord's play, we can express our love and receive the love of Krishna, exchange of love. That's Bhakti Yoga. So Rupa Goswami has given one verse at the beginning of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which explains the lila, tattva we've been discussing. What is the lila? The truth we've been discussing. So where is the love? That's the question. Where is the love? So the first verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu by Srila Rupa Goswami, Akila Rasamrita Murti Prasmara Ruchi Rudra Taraka Pali Kalita Shama Lalito Radha Prayan Vidur Jayati. Let Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, be glorified. By virtue of his expanding, attractive features, he subjugates the gopis named Tarika and Pali and absorbs the minds of Shama and Lalita. He is the most attractive lover of Srimati Radharani and is the reservoir of pleasure for devotees in all transcendental mellows. Remember, our question is, why do we worship Krishna along with Srimati Radharani and the gopis? So that's answered by the science of bhakti given in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So let's explore that a little bit. First of all, what's higher? Again, I ask you, what's higher in your mind? Tattva, the philosophical understanding of the absolute truth that we discussed, or lila, which we've introduced by this verse by Rupa Goswami. Which do you think is the higher truth? Lila. She says lila. Anybody else say something else? Both. Yes, both. That's the answer we're looking for. Both are the same. Both are true. But there's a nice example that explains the difference. Prabhupada gives an example of a high court judge. The high court judge sitting on the bench, he's all powerful. If he moves his eyebrow a certain way, then a decision can take millions of dollars shifted to one person or from another person. He's all powerful sitting on the bench. I had experience actually as a young lawyer. I was in court in Washington, D.C., Federal District Court. And I was making an appearance on behalf of an attorney who couldn't be there that day, but somebody had to go to the court and make the appearance. So I went to the court to make the appearance. And I was talking to the judge, and I was saying, we this, we that. And he looked at me and said, who is we? And I was stunned because I realized I don't know the name of my client. And he was asking me the name of my client. So I stood there totally embarrassed before the all-powerful federal judge. And finally my client mercifully came up and whispered the name in my ear so I could tell it to the judge. The High Court judge has all power, and he exhibits that power. But when he goes home in the evening, he's no longer all-powerful. He's engaged in loving relationships with his wife and children and other family members. He's just like one of the boys. No longer all-powerful, but yet a loving individual. A sweet individual, his sweet personality comes out. And so both Leela and Tattva are the same, but they give us different experiences. They give us different experiences. So, Leela, Krishna's loving exchanges with his devotees. There's also a hierarchy here, because cowherd boys have Leela with Krishna. Mother Yashoda has Leelas with Krishna. Even the servants of Krishna have some loving exchange with him. So why then do we worship Shri Shri Radha Shyam Sundar and the gopis as shown on the altar here today? Why do we worship like that? Why do we? We means Gaudiya Vaishnavas, at least I understand that. We means Gaudiya Vaishnavas. Well, Rupa Goswami explains in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and Prabhupada's Giving Nectar of Devotion explains that the loving relationships with Krishna are five primary loving relationships with Krishna. And as they develop from Shanta Rasa to Dasya Rasa to Sakya Rasa to Vatsalya Rasa to Madhurya Rasa, each becomes sweeter and sweeter, just like sugarcane becomes sugarcane juice, when stirred and cooked, becomes thicker and thicker and thicker. And so each successive loving relationship with Krishna adds what the previous relations had. First there's Shantaras. There's an appreciation of the Lord in all-pervasive form. Then there's Dasharas, which includes the realization of that all-pervasive form, but it adds servitude. Then we move to Sakyaras, that includes Shantaras and Dasharas, but adds an intimacy, a confidentiality of friendship. Vatsalya Ras similarly adds parental affection, adds Shanta, Dasha, Sakya, and Madhurya Ras contains all of the other rasas, their experience in combination in the Madhurya Ras. And so there's this gradation, and what I'd like to do is to show why we conclude that the most complete worship is to worship Shri Shri Radha Shyam Sundar and the gopis on our altar. And I'll do this by giving you some examples from the Nectar of Devotion about how these loving relationships build to the crescendo, to the sonam bonum, to the topmost loving relationship, which is the topmost shelter for all of us, so that it builds step by step. So here are some statements Prabhupada made that refer to pastimes and experiences of the devotees. Shantaras. In the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, it is said that when Lord Krishna was blowing his conch shell known as Panchajanya, many great sages who were living in the caves of the mountains immediately reacted, being awakened from their trance of meditation. They immediately saw the hairs of their body were standing. Sometimes devotees in Santaras become stunned, peaceful, jubilant, deliberate, reflective, anxious, dexterous, and argumentative. These symptoms indicate continuous ecstasy or established emotion. There's another direct statement that says, Uddhava says, Lord Krishna instructing Uddhava in the 11th canto says, the state of being established in my personal form is called Shantarasa, and without being situated in this position, no one can advance to actual, pure devotional service. In other words, no one can be situated in the personal feature of the personality of Godhead, of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without being situated at least in Shantarasa. So my objective with these two quotes is to show the transcendental emotions and ecstasies experienced in the rasa, but that it's a base for the other development of the other rasas. So that's Shanta. I mean, it seems almost ludicrous to say that Shanta, the lowest of the, I mean, it's not low. It's not low. It's not the lowest of anything. It's Shantarasa, that's what it is. So Dasya Rasa. Dasya is the servants. And there's some very interesting description of Krishna's son, Pradyumna. You know that Pradyumna, he was stolen from the home, out of the nursery, just I think the day after he was born or something, isn't it? Yeah. The day he was stolen. And so, fortunately, he came back. There's a long story there. But hear about his and Krishna's sons, in case you ever were concerned about or thought about other relationships. We hear about the gopis, the parents, the friends, the cowherd boyfriends, the servants. So where do the sons of Krishna had so many sons? He had how many wives? 16,108 wives, and each of them had 10 sons. He had a lot of sons. So where do they fit in relationship to Krishna? What's their rasa in Krishna? Well, it's found in this reverential servitude, Dasya Ras. So here, Pradyumna, the eldest son of Krishna, Rukmini Putra. Rukmini Putra. To regard Krishna as one superior is called reverential feeling. And when in addition to this, a devotee feels that Krishna is his protector, his transcendental love for Krishna is increased, and his combined feelings are called reverential devotion. When this steady reverential devotion increases further, it is called love of Godhead and reverential devotion. Attraction and affection are two prominent symptoms of this stage. In reverential devotional attitude, Pradyumna, in this reverential devotional attitude, Pradyumna never talked to his father in a loud voice. In fact, he never so much as unlocked the lips of his mouth, nor did he ever show his face filled with tears. He would always glance only at the lotus feet of his father. And so this had an effect on Krishna himself. And so it describes a little further what Krishna's reaction was. That affection, the affection that Krishna has for his devotees, was expressed by him when he asked Pradyumna not to feel so bashful before him. He addressed Pradyumna thus: "My dear boy, just give up your feeling of inferiority and do not hang your neck. Just talk with me in a clear voice and do not shed tears. You may look straight at me and you may place your hands on my body without any hesitation. There is no need of exhibiting such reverence before your father." So both of them are experiencing, again, if we break down what we described earlier, Pradyumna is feeling protection and Krishna is giving protection. So there's some exchange, some loving exchange in reverential devotion. So next is Sakya, or the friendly relationship with the Lord. This is there's a very interesting point to be made in this regard. It's a specialty of fraternal devotion, or this Rasha, Sakya Rasha. Sakya Rasha has a special sweetness not found in Dasya or Vatsalya. In Dasya, the devotee loves the Lord as his master, and the Lord loves the devotee as his servant. Is that clear? The devotee loves the Lord as his master, and the Lord loves his servant. That's in Dasya Ras. In Vatsalya Ras, the devotee loves the Lord as his son, and the Lord loves the devotee as his parent. So Dasya and Sakya. In Sakya, however, the feeling of Krishna and the devotee are exactly mutual. The devotee loves the Lord as his friend, and the Lord loves his devotee as his friend. You see the difference between the two? Fraternal love and conjugal love are the only relationships in which the Lord and the devotee feel exactly the same way toward each other. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada states, the friendly relationship of the cowherd boys with Krishna is a particular type of spiritual ecstasy, almost similar to the ecstasy of conjugal love. So Sakya Rasa is so special in that regard. There's equality of the loving exchange. And we saw that in what Mother Hari Puja was reading today, isn't it? We saw it with the gopis, how there's an equality between them. He touched their bodies, they touched his body. The special feature of Sakya and Madhurya. So let's just quickly cover the last two. That's also an oxymoron. Quickly cover Vatsalya Ras and Madhurya Ras. What can be done? Vatsalya Ras. Let's see. In the Srimad-Bhagavatam, 10th canto, 13th chapter, verse 33, Sukadeva Goswami tells King Parikshit, "My dear king, as soon as the elder gopis saw their sons coming, there was an inexpressible sign of parental love, and all of them became absorbed in affection. At first they were planning to chastise their sons for stealing butter, But as soon as the sons came before their eyes, they all lost their angry attitude and became overwhelmed with affection. They began to embrace their sons and smell their heads. While doing this, they became almost mad after their children. In their childhood pastimes, these cowherd boys joined with Krishna in stealing butter. But rather than become angry, Mother Yasoda became wet from milk flowing out of her breasts. Out of her affection for Krishna, she began to smell his head repeatedly. When Akrura was present in Vrindavan and was narrating the activities of Krishna in Dwarka, Mother Yasoda was informed that Krishna had married so many queens and was very busy there in his household affairs. Hearing this, Mother Yasoda lamented how unfortunate she was that she could not get her sons married just after he passed his Kaishore age, and that she therefore could not receive both her son and daughter-in-law at her home. She exclaimed, "My dear Akrura, you are simply throwing thunderbolts on my head." These are signs of lamentation on the part of Mother Yashoda in separation from Krishna. Now, finally, again, all these feelings, experiences, rasa, combine to come to the conclusion that why we worship Sri Sri Radhasham Sundar with Srimati Radharani and the gopis on the altar. That's the question. So why do we do that? Because it's the sonam bonum, it is the full expression of all the different rasas with Krishna. It's the full expression of those rasas. And some of our acharyas have spoken of this rasa in terms of being Radha Ashraya, that Radharani is the ultimate shelter for the living being. So this is the highest personal way to interact with Krishna in the conjugal affection, and it includes all the others. So here's something from Nectar Devotion on this. Of course, Nectar Devotion does not cover Madhurya Rasa completely, just gives an introduction. Because it's the sonam bonum and is so intricate and detailed, being the highest, Rupa Goswami wrote Ujjvala Nilamani, which is an explanation of the Madhurya Rasa. The conjugal love of Radha Krishna is never disturbed by any personal consideration. The undisturbed nature of conjugal love between Radha and Krishna is described thus. Just a little distance away from Krishna was Mother Yasoda, and Krishna was surrounded by all his friends. In front of his eyes was Chandravali, and at the same time, on a chunk of stone in front of the entrance to Vraja, stood a demon known as Vrishasura. But even in such circumstances, when Krishna saw Radharani standing behind a bush of many creepers, immediately his beautiful eyebrows moved just like lightning toward her. Of course, as I mentioned, Haripuja read a nice description of the rasa dance. That's ultimately the shelter of all living beings, is to achieve that. But who can achieve such a high goal as to participate with Krishna in the Rasa Leela? We're fortunate that we have Srimad-Bhagavatam. It's Ashraya, as I mentioned, that's the main purpose, the main structure of Srimad-Bhagavatam is serving as Ashraya. Everything is leading up to Ashraya. And in the 10th canto, everything builds to this moment, to the sonam bonum of Krishna's conjugal pastimes with Srimati Radharani, and the fullest expression, as was read in the reading this morning, for millions of years, one night into millions of years, is the Rasa Leela. So we worship Krishna, Srimati Radharani and Krishna, because it is the highest truth. It is the highest shelter for the living beings. And it's a way in which we can realize our personal nature, our personhood in fullest by exchanging love with Krishna. That's why we worship Krishna. That's who Krishna is, the Supreme Ashraya. And that's why we worship him, because it's the most complete way that the living entity can exchange with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, I don't know, are you ready, Ramanya?
Yes.
You think you're ready? Is there any comments, questions? Mahatma Prabhu, can you add something, please?
I want to ask a question. You did that? You were, when you were mentioning the five rasas, then you started with Shantarasa, and you said, something like, don't minimize this, something like this.
Can you say again? I didn't hear.
When you were mentioning the rasas, you started with Shanta, and you were saying, this is something, don't think it's nothing. Something like that, right?
Uh-huh.
So my question is, Mahaprabhu came to give four rasas, he didn't come to give Shanta, so how do we understand that? It seems like it's not part of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. We're not aspiring for Shanta rasa.
Right. Well, the Gaudiya Vaishnavas debate, and actually the debate is found, in, I think, in the Nectar Devotion itself here, that is, or maybe it's a commentary on the Nectar Devotion I was reading, is Shantaras actually a rasa? That question is there, because it has this all-pervasive form. Personal interaction is limited, but it is described as a rasa in Rupa Goswami in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. In Prabhupada's translation, it's also there. So to say that there's no such thing as Shantarasa, or that it doesn't exist, I would hesitate to go that far, because it's described. But at the same time, our acharyas also question whether it's actually a rasa with Krishna, and teach four, as you say, Dashya, Shakya, Vatsalya, and Madhurya. So it's another one of those things where probably both are true. So that's what I'd say. Do you have something?
Only that, because Mahaprabhu,
Because Mahaprabhu came to give four rasas, obviously we're not encouraged to cultivate Shanta ras, whether or not it's a ras, whatever. That was...
Okay, thank you. More?
Prangovinda will say something.
I was saying that Mahaprabhu actually didn't say he came to give rasa, he came to give bhava. It's difference. It becomes rasa, that's a whole science. But I remember when Prabhupada had a conversation with Dr. Patel, and Dr. Patel says, Dr. Patel asked Prabhupada, so what rasa am I? Prabhupada said, you are Santa. And he didn't like it.
Dr.
So
Patel.
Yes. He said, no, Prabhupada, I don't like that. I'm not Santa. So I'll tell you later. So next day, Prabhupada told him, near Juhu, I guess those days, there was some poor people, children nearby. Mm-hmm. And he said, you see these poor children, why don't you do something? You can nicely clean them, dress them, and bring them to temple, instead of their loitering here, there. And then he said, this is not what I do, Prabhupada. Me and my wife, we are philanthropists. We like to do higher things, not this. Prabhupada said, that's why you are Santa. You don't want to do service. You just only philosophize.
Yeah, that's the point. Doing service, the ability to do service. That's the point. So yeah, it's a good addition. Anything else? Anyone else? Okay, we'll end there. Grantaraj Srimad-Bhagavatam.